in the winter sky of 1943, where every mile meant another name etched into the clouds, one B-17 drifted into the jaws of the impossible. 12 German fighters closed in, a storm of steel ready to erase the crew from history. But in the shattered tail of that bomber, a young American gunner was about to make a decision no training manual had ever imagined. 4 minutes later, the air war would never be the same. The European sky in 1943 looked less like air and more like a vast, suspended battlefield. Layer upon layer of vapor trails scarred the cold blue, looping and twisting where bombers had flown, fought, and vanished. To anyone watching from the ground, the distant engines were a dull, distant rumble. Inside the formation, inside the belly of a flying fortress, that sound was a living thing, a relentless thunder that pressed against bones and nerves, promising glory and hinting at oblivion. The air war over Europe had become a grinding contest of endurance, and somewhere in the middle of it, a single tail gunner was about to find out just how far duty could push fear before something inside either broke or transformed forever. By 1943, the Allied bombing campaign was no longer a daring experiment. It was a daily ritual of risk. The B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds lifted off from muddy English airfields and climbed toward thin air, bound for cities most of their crews had never heard of before: war. Their orders were simple on paper and terrifying in practice. Penetrate hostile airspace in tight formation, hold steady under fire, and deliver their cargo of destruction on German industry. Each mission promised to chip away at the enemy's strength, yet the cost was written in the wreckage that did not return. The Luftwaffe, still fierce and cunning, met them with sleek Bf 109 seconds and FULV 190 seconds, turning the sky into a shifting maze of attack runs, evasive turns, and desperate prayers. In the tail of one of those bombers, a B-17 christened Steel Angel, sat Jack Brenner. At 22, he still looked more like a small-town college kid than a hardened combat veteran, but his eyes had already aged beyond his years. He came from a quiet patch of Illinois farmland, a place where the loudest sound most evenings had been crickets in the summer or snow crunching under boots in the winter. Now his world was aluminum, steel, vibration, and the constant awareness that his position, isolated at the rear of the aircraft, made him both a guardian and a target. His twin, 50 caliber guns framed his view of the world, but today he noticed the emptiness beyond them more than the power they held. Steel Angel's crew was a patchwork of American lives stitched together by orders and necessity. Up front, the pilot, Lieutenant Warren Cole, bore the weight of command in tight jawlines and measured movements. Beside him, the co-pilot, Eddie Harmon, kept a hand hovering near the controls as if ready to catch the bomber if it stumbled. The navigator, Sam Delaney, hunched over maps and charts, tracing lines that cut through enemy territory like risky promises. The bombardier, Frank Russo, guarded the nose like a man carrying a secret that could change everything. Further back, the waist gunners, Charlie Moore and Luis Ortega, traded quiet glances that said more than any words could, their hands resting on cold grips. In the radio room, Ben Foster tuned in to static and clipped commands, the thin thread connecting them to home. Together, they formed a team, not because they had chosen each other, but because survival demanded it. Dawn on the airfield had a strange kind of beauty that didn't quite feel like it belonged to the world back home. Floodlights cast long shadows across the hardstand as ground crews moved with practiced urgency around the bombers. The smell was a mix of fuel, oil, wet earth, and the faint metallic tang that always seemed to cling to everything around the planes. Jack walked toward Steel Angel with his parachute harness biting into his shoulders and his flight jacket zipped up to his throat, hearing the muffled clank of tools, the muttered instructions, the occasional forced laugh. Somewhere nearby, another crew posed for a quick photograph, faces tight and strained, trying to look fearless, for a moment that might become a final memory. Briefing had ended not long before, its details still echoing in Jack's mind. The red string on the big wall map had traced their route deep into Germany, beyond the familiar names and into a city that sounded distant and industrial. The kind of place planners promised would make a difference once it was hit. The briefing officer's pointer had tapped the target circle with clinical finality, and nobody had needed to say what everyone knew. The deeper they went, the more time the Luftwaffe had to gather and strike. There had been statistics, 2 losses from previous missions, escort ranges, estimated enemy strength, all wrapped in the calm, practiced tone of men who no longer flinched when talking about planes that did not come back. As Jack climbed the ladder into Steel Angel, the cold crept through his gloves and into his fingers. The interior of the bomber was cramped and familiar, a narrow tunnel of metal, cables, and equipment. He squeezed past the bomb bay, careful not to look down at the lethal weight hanging there, and made his way to the tail. Each step into his small compartment at the rear felt like walking deeper into solitude. Once he settled into his position, the world narrowed to the frame of his window, the sight of the formation behind and below, and the knowledge that if enemy fighters came, he would see them first. The responsibility pressed against his chest as heavily as the oxygen mask he would soon strap on. Pre-mission calm was never truly calm. Jack could feel the tension in his stomach, not as a sharp spike of terror, but as a constant, nervous hum. The engines roared to life, one by one, shaking the plane like a living animal rousing from sleep. The runway lights became blurred streaks as Steel Angel rolled forward, picking up speed, the weight of bombs and fuel pressing them down even as lift tried to tear them free from the earth. Jack felt the moment they broke loose, that slight, shuddering release as wheels left the ground and the bomber climbed into the dark, icy air. He watched the English countryside fall away, swallowed by cloud and distance, replaced by the featureless gray that always seemed to precede danger. At altitude, the cold was a quiet predator, slipping past layers of clothing to find skin and bone. Frost traced delicate lines along the windows of the tail, and Jack's breath turned to mist inside his mask. Around Steel Angel, the other B-17 seconds slid into position, their wings steady and close, the formation coming together like a vast mechanical organism. Far ahead, the rising sun lit the upper edges of the clouds, turning them into a deceptive sea of gold. Somewhere beneath that beauty lay flak batteries and airfields, ready to respond the moment Allied bombers crossed an invisible threshold. Jack scanned the empty sky, fighting the urge to imagine every distant glint as an enemy. Duty told him to stay sharp, to trust his training. Fear whispered that today's mission went deeper than most, that every mile east carried them further from safety and closer, to some unseen point of no return. Hours into the flight, the transition from safe to danger was marked not by a dramatic jolt, but by a quiet message passed along the intercom and a subtle shift in every man's posture. They had crossed into German airspace. Jack's gloved hands tightened on the handles of his guns as his eyes swept the horizon in careful arcs. The radio crackled with terse updates, and the navigator's calculations were replaced by terse confirmations. In the tail, surrounded by the thin metal shell that separated him from the thin, lethal air outside, Jack felt the familiar blend of dread and resolve coil in his chest. Then the first warning came from the radio room, voice crisp and controlled despite the weight behind it. Radar had picked up multiple contacts. Fighters, closing fast. Within moments, scattered specks appeared on the far edge of Jack's vision, moving in disciplined patterns that betrayed their deadly intent, a growing swarm of BFN. 109 seconds angling straight toward Steel Angel's formation, the sky ahead narrowing into a corridor of oncoming threat. The calm before the storm lasted only long enough for every man in the formation to believe, for a fleeting second, that maybe the warning blips on the radar were nothing more than ghosts in the sky. Then the sun shifted behind a thin veil of cloud, and from that blinding white glare came 40 German fighters diving in disciplined arcs, their engines rising in a sharp, brutal crescendo that cut through the quiet like a blade. What had once been open, empty air instantly transformed into a battlefield of motion and sound as streaks of tracer fire lit up the sky in sharp, angular flashes that crisscrossed the formation with terrifying precision. The first explosions erupted somewhere off Steel Angel's left wing, bright bursts that threw fragments of metal into the frigid wind, marking the sudden collapse of the fragile invisibility the bombers had enjoyed only moments earlier. Inside the B-17 formation, The change from calm to chaos was total. Radios erupted with overlapping transmissions, each one urgent, clipped, and nearly impossible to distinguish from the next. Men called out bearings, distances, warnings, but their voices crashed into each other like waves, drowning meaning in static and tension. Vibrations rolled through Steel Angel's frame as the engines fought to hold formation speed, each cylinder pushing against the sudden disruption in the air. Smoke trailed from one of the lead bombers, spreading in a dark, ghostly curtain that made the once clear sky feel smaller, tighter, and closing in from every direction. Even the sunlight seemed different, fractured by the haze into thin, shimmering lines that flickered across metal surfaces. In the rear of Steel Angel, Jack Brenner sat inside the tail turret, surrounded by the thin bubble of plexiglass and metal that defined his world. The cold pressed against him harder now, carried by the frantic movement of air passing over the fuselage. His twin, .50 caliber guns waited in front of him, like the Tenkerns, only two threads connecting him to survival. Their dark shapes steady despite the trembling in his hands. He had always known that the tail was exposed, but at this altitude, under this kind of attack, it felt less like a position and more like a fragile outpost on the edge of the world. Every sound from the plane echoed sharply around him, amplified by the confined space, until it felt as though each vibration was tapping directly into his nerves. Jack's mind moved quickly, but not frantically. Before the war, he had been a mechanic, someone who understood engines and gears, someone who liked the clean, grounded logic of machines. Now he found himself trapped inside one of the most vulnerable parts of a flying fortress, facing a sky that offered no stable ground to stand on and no simple explanation for the chaos unfolding around him. He tried to focus on patterns, angles of approach, distances, the shifting geometry of aircraft moving at hundreds of miles per hour, but the sheer scale of the attack overwhelmed any practiced method he relied on. All he could do now was trust the instinct that had grown inside him over months of missions. A quiet voice telling him when to brace, when to scan faster, when to breathe slower to steady his aim. On the right side of the formation, a B-17 suddenly dropped altitude, trailing a long tail of smoke as its engines faltered. For a moment it seemed as though it might recover, leveling briefly as if fighting to stay in line with the others. But the strain was too much, and the bomber drifted downward, vanishing into a patch of cloud that swallowed it whole. No explosion followed. No announcement crackled through the radio. It simply disappeared, its fate sealed in silence. Another bomber further ahead was struck by a sudden burst of fire that sent one engine into a spiraling failure, the propeller spinning freely before slowing to a dead stop. The aircraft tried to maintain position, but soon it too was falling behind, lost to the relentless forward motion of the remaining formation. Jack's view became a constantly shifting canvas of danger. Fighters darted across the edges of his vision, sharp silhouettes slicing through the thin air with practiced aggression. They came in waves, using the sun and cloud cover to mask their approach, appearing as streaks of color in motion before disappearing just as quickly. Steel Angel shuddered as air currents buckled around the formation, the sky filling with trails of smoke that twisted into long dark ribbons. Every few seconds brought either a burst of sudden brightness, a tracer passing close enough to leave after images on Jack's retinas, or a strange, heavy quiet when a fighter peeled away and the immediate threat seemed to dissolve into thin air. There were moments, brief and haunting, when the combat seemed to slip into slow motion. Jack would catch sight of a bomber drifting sideways, smoke curling from its tail. He would watch a fighter banking sharply, its wings catching the sunlight just right for a heartbeat before it dove back into shadow. These strange pauses, suspended between violence and calm, made the entire scene feel dreamlike, as if the boundary between fear and focus had grown too thin to hold. He knew these pauses were dangerous moments when his mind threatened to drift away from the immediate threat, and he fought to stay anchored, forcing his attention back to the sky behind Steel Angel, scanning for the next wave of attackers. Yet the realization that settled over him was colder than the high-altitude wind creeping past his gloves. The fighter escorts, the sleek P-47 seconds that usually rode high above the formation, were nowhere to be seen. They had fallen behind, forced to return to base, or pushed out of position by fuel limits and earlier engagements. The bomber crews had known this might happen, had been warned during briefing that extended missions meant the escorts could not protect them all the pressed way to the target. But knowing was not the same as feeling the weight of that absence in the middle of an assault. Jack could sense the shift in the formation's mood, even without hearing the words. They were alone now, 12 planes of aluminum and courage, facing a growing storm without the sharp teeth of the escort fighters to break it apart. Steel Angel jolted as a burst of cannon fire struck the fuselage near the tail, sending a spray of metallic fragments across Jack's compartment. None struck him, but the shock traveled through his hands, rattling the grips of his guns. He tried to respond, to swing the turret and track the attackers, but something felt wrong. A stiffness in the mechanism, a faint grinding resistance that should not have been there. He pulled harder, trying to bring the turret around, and felt the awful certainty settle in his stomach. The mechanism had jammed. At that same moment, 3 Messerschmitts broke from the pack and aligned themselves directly behind Steel Angel, advancing in perfect formation, their silhouettes growing larger with each passing second as they closed in on the immobilized tail. The jam in Jack Brenner's turret revealed itself not through any dramatic snap or metallic crack, but through a subtle, stubborn resistance that refused to ease no matter how hard he pushed against the controls. The turret ring, normally gliding smoothly along its track with mechanical precision, had seized somewhere deep within the narrow cavity of gears and bearings beneath his seat. In training, the instructors had warned that a jam like this represented the worst kind of in-flight malfunction, not because it was rare, but because it was nearly impossible to fix at 25,000 feet while under attack. The bitter cold thickened lubricants and vibrations from the engines shook loose particles of frost and grit that could wedge themselves into the smallest openings. Worse still was the reality that any attempt to manually free the mechanism meant prying loose from the secure posture of the seat and exposing oneself to the open arc of the turret's view, a space barely protected from incoming fire. In normal circumstances, no one would attempt such a repair mid-battle. The risk far outweighed the chance of success. But nothing about this moment resembled normal circumstances. With Steel Angel shuddering under the constant strain of incoming passes, and 3 Messerschmitts angling into perfect alignment behind them, Jack realized that waiting for help or hoping for a miracle would cost every man on the aircraft his life. He reached down, gripping the cold metal of the turret housing, and felt the thin vibration of the jammed ring as it fought against the plane's movement. Sweat gathered beneath his goggles despite the freezing air. He could barely hear his own breath over the tremors of the engines and the storm of threats approaching from behind. There was no time to call for assistance. No one could crawl back to the tail compartment in these conditions without risking being thrown into open air or torn apart by wind and debris. The choice settled upon him with heavy clarity. If he didn't force the turret to move, Steel Angel would not survive another minute. The moment Jack unlatched his safety brace and shifted his weight off the seat, the world changed. The bomber dipped suddenly as the pilot reacted to evasive warnings from the formation lead, sending the tail swaying in a wide, uncontrolled arc. Jack braced himself with one gloved hand against the frame, using the other to force the turret handles toward the jammed sector of the ring. Every inch he gained felt like pushing against the weight of the entire aircraft. The mechanism groaned, resisting with mechanical stubbornness as vibration from the engines traveled up his arms. The turret shuddered, then stopped, then shuddered again. He strained harder, muscles tightening with every surge of motion. The effort sent him leaning into exposed angles where the thin plexiglass no longer shielded him. In those seconds, he understood why others called this kind of maneuver suicidal. He was willingly placing himself into arcs where incoming fire could reach him before he ever had the chance to respond. Steel Angel lurched again, this time from the shockwave of a nearby bomber taking a hit. The air churned violently, shaking the tail until it felt like the entire structure might tear away. Jack knew the Messerschmitts were closing in. He could sense their approach in the way the light shifted through his compartment, the way shadows elongated across the fuselage, the way the engines from the fighters hummed at a pitch that meant they were preparing to strike. He forced the turret again, harder than before, and felt something give way not fully, but enough to nudge the guns into a slightly wider arc. A thin metallic snap echoed through the turret, followed by a grinding click. and suddenly the guns moved just a fraction further. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him a sliver of an angle. He seized that moment. As the three Messerschmitts leveled out in perfect formation behind Steel Angel, their silhouettes sharp and growing by the second, Jack wrapped both hands around the handles and pulled with everything he had left. The turret snapped free, jerking into motion so abruptly that it nearly ripped him forward. His seat harness swung empty beside him as he leaned into the guns, aligning his sights through the narrow arc of the tail window. The fighters were close now, far closer than any training scenario would ever have allowed, but that proximity provided the one advantage he needed. Without hesitation, he opened fire. The recoil pressed through his arms, not violent enough to injure, but strong enough to remind him that the guns were nearing the threshold of overheating. The vibration from the aircraft, combined with the rapid firing, created a tremor that traveled through his shoulders and spine. Tracers arced toward the advancing planes, disappearing into the thin air before reappearing seconds later in faint, flickering lines that converged upon the attackers. The first Messerschmitt swayed abruptly. The second rolled off course, and the third dipped sharply as the formation unraveled. Jack watched the pattern of incoming threats shift, their approach disrupted not by destruction, but by sudden disarray. The tactic had worked in a matter of seconds. He had broken the coordinated maneuver of three fighters that had moments earlier held them in a deadly crosshatch. But there was no time to celebrate and no sense of triumph. The success served only as a fleeting moment of relief before another wave approached. Jack could see them gathering in the distance, 12 fighters descending from scattered altitudes, each adjusting to exploit the brief window of vulnerability created by the jammed turret and the bomber's unstable flight path. He felt the heat from the guns now, subtle but unmistakable as warmth crept through the metal grips. The turret's rotation was still, imperfect, catching twice in the same sector where the jam had partially cleared. He forced it again and again, ignoring the strain spreading across his arms and back. His world narrowed to a single purpose: protect the crew, keep the fighters at bay, and buy enough time for Steel Angel to hold formation. Flames crept into the tail section as small fires ignited from overheated components. The smoke carried a sharp, acrid scent that mingled with the cold air and settled around Jack like a choking shroud. His eyes watered behind the goggles. He kept firing, focusing on each approaching fighter with absolute clarity, refusing to let fear or exhaustion disrupt his aim. The aircraft shook under continuous pressure. The tail felt increasingly unstable, but Jack held to his guns with unbroken resolve, fighting back each new threat as the air around him turned darker with smoke. Then, abruptly, the entire tail section convulsed as a direct hit struck the turret. The compartment filled with a dense cloud of smoke, visibility dropping to nearly nothing. Jack felt the guns seize beneath his hands, the mechanisms locking with grim finality as silence replaced the steady rhythm of firing. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the distant rush of wind. Then Steel Angel began to drop, tilting into a gradual but undeniable descent as the formation held its altitude and the bomber fell away into the shadow of the clouds below. For a moment that felt suspended outside of time, Steel Angel existed in a strange, impossible quiet. The deafening chaos of battle dropped away as though someone had pulled a curtain across the sky, leaving only a drifting shape of metal and smoke sliding through the cold upper air. The bomber no longer held its place in the formation. It floated alone, dipping unevenly with each fading pulse of its engines, its once gleaming frame now a patchwork of darkness, fractured metal, and scorched paint. Inside, the crew moved in tense fragments of motion, speaking in short, breathless notes that neither comforted nor reassured. They thought the tail had been severed. They thought Jack Brenner was gone. And yet the aircraft against all reason refused to fall. The first thing that struck the men in the forward compartments was the unnatural balance of the aircraft. When the turret took the hit, the shock had carried through the fuselage like a stone striking a bell. Lieutenant Warren, Cole, gripping the control yoke with hands that trembled only slightly, felt Steel Angel sag to one side and then level in a slow, unsteady rhythm. The right wing dipped more than the left, a sign of severe drag. Under normal circumstances, this imbalance would have deepened rapidly, turning into a spiraling descent too violent to correct. But somehow, through a mixture of battered aerodynamics and sheer mechanical stubbornness, The bomber found a shallow glide. Its silhouette wavered in the thinning sky, haunted and determined. The crew had no time to wonder how such a wreck remained airborne. Smoke rolled through the radio room in loose ribbons as Ben Foster fought to maintain contact with base. His equipment flickered, a mosaic of broken circuits and intermittent static. Updates from other surviving aircraft echoed faintly casualty reports, return headings, uneven attempts at regrouping. None mentioned Steel Angel. It was as though the bomber had vanished from the sky, a silent ghost drifting somewhere beneath the tangle of clouds and smoke trails left behind by the larger force. In the cockpit, Warren Cole and Eddie Harmon exchanged glances that carried no panic, only a deep and exhausted determination. Eddie scanned what remained of the flight instruments, noting readings that bounced between impossible values. Fuel pressure dropped on 2 engines and hovered dangerously on the 3rd. The 4th sputtered intermittently, its internal rhythm disrupted by damage neither pilot could see. Eddie eased the throttle on the surviving pair, trying to coax them into synchrony, as fire crept along the right-wing route like a quiet, consuming shadow. They could hear air where metal should have been, feel the vibration of holes that had torn through vital sections of the fuselage. Yet the bomber held a forward line, however fragile. Behind the pilots, Frank Russo and Sam Delaney worked wordlessly, scanning for signs of structural collapse. Sam traced his fingers along a set of cracked beams that bent outward near the navigation station, feeling the cold seep through new, unwelcome openings in the skin of the aircraft. Frank steadied himself near the bomb bay, its doors partially buckled, resisting the slipstream with a stubbornness that surprised even him. There was no room for reflection, no space for fear. Every man simply acted, pushing back against the creeping sense that the bomber was transitioning from flight to drift and from drift to descent. In the waist section, Charlie Moore and Luis Ortega moved with grim urgency through a haze of smoke and falling insulation. They shouted Jack's name toward the rear, their voices swallowed by the hollow echo of the fuselage. Neither expected an answer. The tail section looked like a charred silhouette when glimpsed through the scattered openings in the fuselage, a half-melted dome of what had once been a turret, surrounded by warped metal that glowed faintly from residual heat. The 2 gunners exchanged a brief, heavy look. They believed Jack had been lost when the hit struck, and the silence in the back seemed to confirm it. But Jack was still alive. Barely conscious, half buried beneath the twisted frame of the turret, he drifted in and out of awareness. The cramped space around him felt smaller than ever, filled with smoke that bit at his throat as he tried to draw shallow breaths through his oxygen mask. The heat along the metal surfaces had cooled into a brittle, uneasy stillness. His gloves brushed across the handles of the guns, now frozen in place, and his vision blurred in and out of focus as he tried to make sense of the dim, fractured world inside his bubble of shattered plexiglass. Though he could not yet move, he sensed the aircraft's rhythm, the shifting weight, the shallow tilt, the determination in its unsteady glide. Somewhere deep inside, he felt the continued presence of the crew. They were fighting to stay alive, and he was still part of that fight. As Steel Angel drifted away from enemy territory, the distant shapes of cloud banks opened to reveal the faint glimmer of the English Channel. It lay far below, steel gray and calm beneath a sky that had once seemed wide and invincible. But between the bomber and that distant stretch of water remained miles of danger. The engines coughed as a sudden downdraft pressed against the weakened frame, and the bomber dipped lower, rattling with a tremor that made every man aboard brace for an uncontrolled fall. Warren and Eddie worked together, adjusting trim tabs that barely responded, easing the plane through the turbulent air. The fire along the wing had slowed, beaten back by altitude and wind, but the structural damage it left behind was unmistakable. Steel Angel limped through the sky with a pride that bordered on defiance. 2 engines had now gone silent, spinning slowly in the cold light. The remaining pair strained to keep the bomber aloft. Each second felt like a borrowed moment. Each mile earned through grit rather than mechanics. In the fragile quiet that followed the last defensive climb, the crew felt a strange mix of hope and dread. The worst seemed behind them, yet none dared to believe it. Survival depended on a failing machine finding just enough strength to keep moving. The coastline, no more than a faint, wavering line on the horizon, felt impossibly far. Then a single shadow cut across the distant sunlight. It moved with deliberate purpose, closing the distance at a steady pace. A lone Bf-109, separated from the original attack group, had found them. It descended with the cold patience of a predator that understood it had discovered wounded prey. Steel Angel, barely holding together, braced for a final fight it was in no condition to survive. Steel Angel approached the English coastline as though it were drifting through the final frame of a fading reel. Each movement slow, stubborn, and impossible in its persistence. The crew barely recognized the airfield until the familiar shapes of hangars and control towers emerged through the morning haze. What remained of the bomber rattled with every gust of wind, its wings patched with openings that distorted the air around them, its tail section hanging on through little more than fractured supports and sheer will. Warren Cole and Eddie Harmon guided the aircraft with a quiet concentration that bordered on disbelief, adjusting power from the two surviving engines until the bomber skimmed above the runway with a shaky grace. When the wheels touched down, the landing felt less like a controlled descent and more like a final surrender. Steel Angel rolled to a halt in a long, trembling drift across the tarmac, coming to rest with its nose slightly bowed, as if humbled by the journey. It had survived. Ground crews rushed toward the bomber, slowing only when they saw the extent of its injuries. The fuselage bore scars that cut through paint, rivets, and structure, leaving jagged impressions of impacts that had tested every inch of the aircraft. One of the landing gear struts shuddered under the weight, barely holding firm. Smoke drifted from the right wing, curling upward in faint, ghostly streaks. To the ground crew, it was a miracle that Steel Angel had remained airborne at all, let alone found its way home. They climbed aboard with practiced urgency, checking on the pilots first, then moving down the narrow spine of the aircraft toward the waist compartment. When they reached the tail, they paused in shock. The turret was nearly unrecognizable. Its outer plating had melted into warped shapes. The plexiglass bubbled into uneven patches that caught the light in distorted reflections. What remained of the structure bowed inward, its framework twisted into unnatural lines. Yet inside this half-collapsed chamber lay Jack Brenner, slumped forward and motionless, but unmistakably alive. His flight jacket, lined with soot and frost, rose and fell with shallow breaths. When the rescuers gently pulled him from the wreckage, a ripple of disbelief passed through the crew. It wasn't just that he had survived, it was that he had endured the very part of the aircraft that seemed least likely to protect anyone. As they carried him out into the crisp morning air, the sunlight revealed the darkened edges of the turret, its metal worn thin by the heat and stress of combat. The contrast between the damage and the faint rhythm of Jack's breath left many speechless. Within hours, the crew found themselves seated in a debriefing room, the walls lined with maps and mission logs, the air thick with fatigue and the lingering scent of coffee that had long since gone cold. Officers questioned each of them in turn, not with suspicion, but with a bewildered curiosity that struggled to align their written reports with the reality of what Steel Angel had endured. When they reached the subject of Jack's role in the battle, the room shifted into an almost reverent silence. 12 enemy fighters had been counted as destroyed during the contact window, each aligning with the brief, frantic burst of defensive fire from the tail position. The timestamps revealed something no one in the room could readily comprehend. Those 12 kills had occurred in less than 4 minutes. To the officers, it bordered on impossible. Tail gunners rarely had clear firing arcs, and even the most experienced crews found it difficult to break coordinated enemy attacks. Yet Jack's improvised maneuver, born from desperation and unfiltered resolve, had disrupted an entire strike wave and forced a recalibration of the Luftwaffe's approach during that engagement. Military analysts noted immediately that his reckless attempt to force the turret into new angles had created a wider defensive field than standard training ever addressed. For years, gunners had been instructed to hold fixed positions, maintain steady lines, and avoid forcing jammed systems. Jack had done the opposite, taking a fractured, half-functioning turret and turning it into a shifting defense point that altered the rhythm of the attack. What followed in the weeks ahead became an unexpected chapter in the evolving doctrine of aerial warfare. Engineers and trainers reviewed the crew's testimony, sketching diagrams of the altered firing paths and mapping how the temporary expansion of Jack's arc had disrupted enemy formations. His bold move prompted modifications that allowed for more flexible rotation tolerances in later turret models and led to updated training that encouraged gunners to improvise under system failures rather than concede angles of defense. Though rarely mentioned by name, the influence of his actions filtered quietly into flight manuals, technical briefings, and mission preparations across multiple bomber groups. His 4 minutes of instinct reshaped how crews approached defensive engagements, offering them one more chance to adapt when the sky turned against them. In the hospital ward where Jack recovered, the days passed in a haze of fatigue. His crew visited when they could, bringing fragments of news from the field, stories of new tactics, shifts in formation patterns, and subtle acknowledgments from officers who rarely offered praise. Jack listened with quiet humility, struggling to reconcile the scale of the battle with the narrowed, smoke-filled world he had known in the tail turret. To him, survival had been less a triumph than a moment of necessity, driven by the unspoken belief that every man aboard deserved the chance to see home again. As the months turned into years, Jack's name drifted into the long, crowded lists of wartime participants. He received commendations, but his story remained small beside the vast, unfolding narrative of the air campaign. Yet, the lessons his actions inspired, endured, etched into technical diagrams, buried in training lectures, and carried in the unspoken understanding among airmen that courage often meant stepping beyond what was reasonable in the moment when everything demanded resolve. Decades later, in a quiet museum corner warmed by afternoon light, the tailgun assembly from Steel Angel stood on display. Its metal bore the faded evidence of heat and pressure, its inner surfaces still warped from the intensity of that long-past mission. Visitors paused before it, sometimes tracing its lines with thoughtful eyes, sensing the weight of a story they knew only in fragments. The sunlight glinted softly off its scarred surface, illuminating the small plaque beneath it, a plaque that mentioned a gunner, a moment, and a legacy that had shaped the skies. In 4 minutes of fury, one man changed the way the world fought the sky. Stay with this story, because voices like Jack Brenner's remind us why these forgotten moments still matter. If you want more untold chapters of courage, help this mission reach others who've never heard them. And as you think about what happened in those 4 minutes, ask yourself one thing. If you were trapped in that burning tail, with your crew depending on you, would you have taken the same gamble Jack did?